This segment of artillery firing is going to cover shell fire. And shell fire can be things that are classified as howitzers, Licorns in the Russian army, mortars, and a little subset of things called rockets. Now a howitzer is typically a short barreled length or stubby length cannon barrel, as you can see here, compared to normal cannon. And that's how you can typically identify them on the tabletop. In this particular example, I have a combined howitzer battery, or a howitzer battery, in the service of Prussia. And we're going to go through the shellfire table rules utilizing that battery and also other batteries. In addition to that, in the foreground, I have a rocket battery, which I will cover in a short while. Now, shellfire is a little bit different. It has a direct fire aspect, i.e. straight, just like normal artillery, and typically that's going to be for its canister shots. It's, again, very similar. Howitzers can fire canister shots just like normal artillery. And the firing of those canister shots is just like any other artillery battery and done the same way. But shellfire's got a couple different unique characteristics. Basically, they're lobbing the shells towards the enemy. So it's not technically a direct fire weapon. In most circumstances, you have to be able to see the enemy, just like before, but they lob the shots. So they have some cases some unique characteristics. Now the shellfire is done on its own little separate table, which is found below the artillery firepower tables. So if you're using canister, you would utilize the normal artillery fire tables. And you'll find a line that's called small howitzer case or large howitzer case, and those are the respective lines that you utilize. But if you're actually using shellfire, you have to go to the shellfire table and look up either large shell or mortar or small shell or mortar, and there's also lines for the rockets and siege mortars and things of that nature. Again, just as before, you find the number of cannon to fire, or in this case howitzers, and come down to the base percentages. So the mechanics of the table work the same as normal artillery firepower, but the effects are a little bit different. Remember, we're dealing with exploding items now, exploding bomb-like round shot compared to the solid core round shot or the shotgun effect of canister or case. So performing the firepower aspect is exactly the same, but some of the effects are different. For example, when you fire a howitzer shot, and let's say they want to fire at this square, French, normally you would have to reduce it, if it was a case shot or a direct fire weapon, by the screen that's in front. But shellfire has no such reduction. It ignores enemy screens. You can fire through or over your own screen, and it will also ignore the enemy screen. So when it lands on a mass target like a square, the effect is going to be quite good. The difference is you have to have one additional roll. If you are firing at a target that's within 15 inches, you do not have to go on to the accuracy table. And this applies to either rockets or shell. But when you fire over 15 inches in range, you automatically have to get a 6D and roll on the accuracy table to see how effective your firepower was. And there's two columns, one for shell fire and one for rockets. And by the way, rockets, sorry if I mentioned it earlier, automatically have to go on the accuracy table anytime they fire. So the key rule, break distance, is 15 inches. If you're firing more than 15 inches for shell fire, howitzers, that type of stuff, then you have to roll a 6D if you're firing greater than 15 inches. And it could be a case where your firepower has totally no effect at all, or it could be an increase in effectiveness by 50%. The other unique capability of shellfire is it has the ability to set items or terrain on fire. It won't set the figures on fire, but it will set the terrain which they occupy on fire. And anytime you fire a howitzer battery or a rocket battery, there's a base percentage chance times the number of cannon firing to equal the possibility of setting some object on fire. And you can really check the rules, but basically howitzers have a 3% chance against a class 2 or 3 building and a 5% chance per barrel on a class 1 building. So if it's a wood building and you've got 8 guns firing, there's a 40% chance for you to get, when you roll to hit a 40 or less, you caught the building on fire in addition to possible loss of figures in the target unit. Now you can't randomly shoot at terrain when it's not occupied by enemy. It just wasn't done. Rockets have a different capability, and also in certain times of the year the grain fields might get set on fire. But these are sort of unique rules. But keep in mind, howitzers have this capability due to their explosive shells and contents. Now, firing siege mortars or mortars is exactly the same as howitzers. Number of barrels times range, all that good stuff. There's really no difference. Obviously, a siege mortar is going to have a lot more effect than an ordinary howitzer. Now, in addition to that, in this case, we had a whole battery of howitzers, and that's pretty unique to the Prussian army, and I think there's one in the English army. But most nations typically do not form combined howitzer batteries. Or if they do, they pull the howitzers out of their line batteries. And typically, in an average French battery, for example, there's 8 cannon, as we know. But of those 8 cannon, 2 of them are howitzers. So in effect, if the player elects to, he can just fire the 2 howitzers out of his battery at a possible enemy target, and leave the other 6 cannons silent. They won't be firing for that fire phase. It doesn't come up very often, but it's a pretty poor chance. But you never know. It might be a circumstance where he wants to fire. In addition, if you fire the battery at full effect at a terrain feature, let's say a wooden building again, and you rolled a real low percentage on your to-hit roll, for example, 8%, and since it's 5% chance per barrel, and there's 2 barrels of howitzers in your battery, in theory there's a 10% chance anytime you fire at a building to set it on fire. So keep that in mind whenever you're shooting at terrain that looks like it's possibly a flammable target. Even with an ordinary line battery, if there's a couple of howitzers in your battery and you roll a real low percentage set of dice on your to-hit roll, like 5% or 10% or something like that, investigate to see if you actually set the terrain on fire, which causes problems for the defenders because they eventually have to evacuate the burning building or try and put it out. Typically that, by the way, is done in the command phase when terrain fires and things of that nature are taking effect. Now let's go over to the rocket. Rockets are unique to the English army. There is an Austrian battery in the late period wars of 1814 onwards, but the English are the ones that notoriously use these inaccurate and wild weapons. They're basically an overgrown terror weapon of the maximum degree. They operate just like shell fire and direct fire at the same time. You can't do indirect fire with a rocket per se. The difference is when you fire, it's the number of launchers in the battery, and there's typically 6. You fire it like any other battery. You look up on the charts and the same mechanism of how many tubes or rocket launchers are firing, come to your base percentage and things of this nature. The difference what comes is if you ever get a hit with a rocket, there's a possibility of catastrophic morale effect on the enemy. They just didn't like it at all. So whenever you get a hit with a rocket, there's an adjustment of -3 or 30% on your morale check for the unit that just lost, if it was a foot unit or a battery. In addition, if a battery takes a hit, there's modifiers on the critical hit roll for additional damage. It's usually a +1 to the die. That same rule applies for howitzer fire. If you get shell fire hits on batteries, the critical hit counter battery table are +1s on your die rolls. Otherwise, if a rocket hits a cavalry unit, then it's a -5 or 50% chance for the unit against its morale check. So it's another way of saying that the unit is going to most likely just panic and simply run from the rear. Also on top of that, if the unit actually breaks or runs, you take another special check. If the unit started with a 7 or less on the morale grade, basically a non-elite unit, there's a 20% chance it will outright surrender. Basically, you take the entire unit off the board immediately. So a rocket could fire at this cavalry, either cause it to rout or run away, but there's also a chance it might just outright surrender. And basically they just surrender up their arms and just scatter across the battlefield. They're just gone. There was an instance of this at the Battle of Leipzig when the English artillery, horse artillery with the rocket troop, unloaded on a French square. The French didn't like it, and that's it, they just surrendered right then and there. So rockets are pretty rare and unique. There's also one other thing about a rocket. Anytime you fire it, if you look on the rocket accuracy table and you roll a 1, there was a launcher explosion. In other words, it blew up, it's an old gold. It blew up itself, and you've lost the effectiveness of one launcher in the battery, and you take a down 1 morale check. There are other unique little firepowers or capabilities, especially like in the Prussian army with their howitzers. They can fire and do indirect fire. Now, most armies or nations, you have to fire at a unit or fire into a terrain feature. You can't fire beyond a terrain feature. Remember, enemy units do not block line of sight or line of fire of any way. But the Prussian artillery, especially the howitzer batteries, have the capability of firing indirect fire, firing into the dead zone behind a terrain feature. There's obviously severe modifiers for doing this thing, but they did have that capability or that tactical doctrine. It's a sort of a hangover from the 7 Years' War. So if you ever have a Prussian army and you elect to fire indirect fire, keep that in the back of your mind. It is possible, especially if you have a mass artillery fire. Look at the rules for more definition exactly how to do it and the restrictions.